All right, Esther chapter 9, we're going to pick up at verse 20, and then we're going to stop at the end of verse 9, chapter 9, and I'm going to leave chapter 10, all three verses, to Phil next week as he wraps it up. Okay, he doesn't have confidence that he can stretch three verses out for the entire hour. I have more confidence in him that he can, so we're going to see who's right. So I think he can do that next week, so we'll come back and see what all he adds and throws into those three verses. But we're picking up tonight in chapter 9, verse 20. And we saw last week where we ended in verse 19 as the second decree that Mordecai gives for the Jewish people that allows them to sort of counteract the first decree of Haman, which was that on that certain day in a certain month, that all the people in the provinces could basically destroy the Israelites and take all their stuff. And so now with Mordecai's decree, they're able to defend themselves and to actually plunder those who would attack them. And we saw last week how they end up killing tens of thousands of those who came against them, and it sort of resulted in this sort of spontaneous, organic kind of celebration and joy and delight that sort of was expressed itself in taking of certain foods and giving them gifts, and it became a great celebration of all that God had given them and done for them. And so tonight we're going to continue to see sort of what unfolds after that. And we're going to look at how it came to be, or how sort of this celebration of what's known as Purim came to be in the life of the Jewish people. And so before we jump into the text, I want to just give you a little bit of description of how that celebration, that feast, that festival is practiced or observed in today's society and culture where it is observed among Jewish people. And so in March of this coming year, 2025, the Festival of Purim will be celebrated on March 13th and 14th of this upcoming year. Jews will gather in their synagogues where they observe this. Obviously, not every Jew is a practicing Jew that observes all the feasts and festivals, but where it is observed and where they do celebrate it, they'll gather in their synagogues on the evening of March 13th, and they will have read aloud to them the book of Esther. It will be read in sort of not just the way we read the text, but read basically in sort of a rhythmic, musical kind of incantation, a recital of the book of Esther. They'll then gather the next day, the next morning, and they'll have the book of Esther read to them a second time. And each time it's read, or sung basically, before it's sung or before it's read, they will together, they'll sort of have these three blessings that they'll say. And so the first is, "Blessed are you, my Lord and our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments and has commanded us according to the reading of Esther." And then, "Blessed are you, my Lord, our God, the King of the universe, who has wrought miracles for our forefathers in those days at this season. Blessed are you, my Lord, our God, King of the universe, who has kept us alive, sustained us, and brought us to this season." So then they read the book again, and then at the end of reading, they'll say one last blessing that reads like this: "Blessed are you, my Lord, our God, King of the universe, the God who takes up our grievance, judges our claim, avenges our wrong, who brings just retribution upon all our enemies of our soul, and exacts vengeance for us from our foes. Blessed are you, my Lord, who exacts vengeance for his people Israel from all their foes, the God who brings salvation." And a part of this feast, they'll give gifts to each other. They'll give food to each other. They basically will give two gifts to one person, and they'll help two people who are in need, who need some form of charity. Now, when the book is read, when the names of Haman's 10 sons are read, they're read in one breath. So that they say the names of the 10 sons that Phil tried to pronounce last week, and then I'm not going to try to pronounce this week. They'll say the names of those 10 sons in one breath. And the purpose behind that is to signify how all 10 of those sons died at the same time. Remember, they're all hung. They're all sort of are murdered at the same time. So they'll say all their names in one breath together. And also, when they come to the name Haman throughout the book, where his name is listed 54 times in the book of Esther. And every time the name Haman is read, as the person reading or reciting the book says his name, the rest of the congregation, especially the kids, make as much noise as they can so you can't hear the naming of his name. And the purpose behind that is because Haman's ancestor was an Amalekite. And back in the book of Exodus, God promised that he would blot out the name of Amalek. And so when Haman, who's an ancestor of Amalek, and his name is read throughout the book 54 times, the congregation makes it so that you can't hear his name to signify God's promise that Amalek's name and his descendants would be blotted out from existence, basically. And so they will have this parade that's also a part of the celebration. They'll go around in sort of masquerade and masks as a part of their observance of Purim. And the purpose behind these masks is twofold. One, remember, they're giving gifts. And so it's an act of anonymity, not wanting the other person to know who's giving them the gift. Secondly, and more interestingly, they wear these masks and they hide themselves to signify that God's work in the book of Esther is hidden and mysterious. Remember, his name's never mentioned anywhere in the book, but you see his hand of providence working mysteriously in a hidden way all throughout the entire story in the book of Esther. So these are sort of some of the things that take place in this feast. And so we're going to look at this evening, this sort of official beginning of the celebration of Purim. And what we see, sort of the main idea of these verses, is that God's deliverance of his people should be remembered with celebration. God's deliverance of his people should be remembered with celebration. I want you to see, first of all, in verses 20 through 22, that Mordecai inaugurates the celebration. Mordecai inaugurates the celebration. Look at verse 20. And Mordecai recorded these things and sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both near and far, obligating them to keep the 14th day of the month Adar, and also the 15th day of the same, year by year, as the days on which the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month that had been turned for them from sorrow into gladness, and from mourning into a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and gladness, days for sending gifts of food to one another, and gifts to the poor. So remember, at the end of the passage last week, the response of the people to God's deliverance is this organic celebration that breaks out. They're giving gifts, they're giving food, they just have this time of great celebration. So Mordecai sees this, and Mordecai, obviously led, we believe, by the Holy Spirit, or led by God to do everything he's doing. Mordecai sets out to make sure that organic celebration of God's deliverance is something that is ordained or decreed for the rest of their generations. So they're to remember what God's done, celebrate what God's done, and that's what you see Mordecai here doing. He records what's happening, and then he begins to send out all these letters to all the Jews in all the provinces, and notice he's obligating them, verse 21, to keep that day, the 14th day, or depending on where they live, maybe the 15th day, as the day that they will observe the feast of Purim, the celebration of Purim. And notice the reason in verse 22 is the days in which the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month that had been turned for them from sorrow into gladness. Remember that when the first decree of Haman comes out, the whole Susa is thrown in confusion and chaos, and you can imagine the terror that existed all throughout the empire on behalf of the Jews, knowing that at that day in the future, unless God intervened in some miraculous way, that they were going to be exterminated. They were going to be extinguished and destroyed completely. But God turns that time of sorrow into gladness, that time of mourning into a holiday. That they should make them days of feasting and gladness, days for sending gifts of food to one another and gifts to the poor. So in celebration of this great reversal that God's wrought, where he turned slaughter into sorrow and mourning into gladness and holiday, Mordecai says this celebration has to be observed every year, henceforth forevermore, on behalf of the Jewish people, to remember and celebrate what God's done for them. So Mordecai inaugurates the celebration. Number 2, verse 23, the Jews then practice the celebration. The Jews practice the celebration. Look at verse 23. So the Jews accepted what they had started to do. Remember, this was organic on their behalf in response to what God had done. So they hear this decree that Mordecai gives them to continue the celebration year after year. The Jews accepted what they had started to do and what Mordecai had written to them. Again, the reason, verse 24, for Haman, the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast that is, cast lots, to crush and to destroy them. But when it came before the king, he gave orders in writing that his evil plans that he had devised against the Jews should return on his own head, and that he and his sons should be hanged on the gallows. Therefore, they called these days Purim, after the term pure. So again, we're sort of rehashing or summarizing everything we've seen up to this point when you look at verses 24 through 25. We're giving just a quick summary of what has happened. Haman has this plot of evil, and his goal was to exterminate, destroy the Jews entirely. And God takes that scheme of evil, that strategy of the enemy, and uses the very things the enemy has set up for the destruction of Israel for the destruction of Haman, the enemy of Israel. And so that's the reason for this celebration, that God's worked this huge, amazing reversal in the life of his people. And notice what they call it. They call it Purim, verse 26, after the term pure. So the term pure means lot. And we would think of lots today as sort of a crude example of dice or die, right? So it would be something that they would use in that day and time, basically sort of superstitious, of casting of lots to determine certain decisions that needed to be made. And the plural of pure is Purim. So why is it that they name this yearly annual celebration of what God's done? Why did they name it Purim? Turn back to Esther chapter 3 and look at verse 7. So in Esther 3 verse 7, in the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast that is, they cast lots, before Haman day after day, and they cast it month after month, till the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. So the they there are the astrologers, the magicians, the sorcerers, all those sort of spiritual, wacky people in the Persian Empire. And what they would do is that at the beginning of a year, for certain important things that needed to take place, they would cast these lots to determine what days they needed to accomplish these things. And so Haman, in following that tradition or that practice, he has an important day coming up in this upcoming year where he wants to destroy all the Jews. And so he goes to these astrologers and these sorcerers and these magicians, and he has them at the beginning of the year to begin casting lots to figure out what day in the upcoming year that he should set to destroy all the Jews. And the day that they determined by the casting of these lots was that 12th month, which is the month of Adar. So that's how they came to determine the day in which the Jews would be destroyed. They cast lots to figure out what day. So now that God's worked this great reversal on their behalf, this great deliverance, they name this celebration in light of that reversal, they name it Purim. Because in Proverbs chapter 16, verse 33, there the Bible says the lot is cast in the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord. So it was a way, number one, of reminding themselves how the one who cast the lots, Haman, was destroyed. But it also, secondly, was a reminder in the very name of the celebration that it is God who determines how those lots fall out. It's God who determines each person's fate, how things will resolve themselves, and in this instance, how God would deliver his people. One pastor described it like this. He said, so why Purim? Why call it Purim? Why that choice of a name? Why would you basically call this celebration dice, if we could put it in our vernacular today? Why would you use that as your festival name? And he says it recognizes first the destruction of the one who rolled the dice, and secondly, it honors the glory of the one who truly controls the roll. So it reminds them Haman was destroyed. It reminds them that God controls how those lots fall out, where they are, what they determine when they stop, wherever you might throw them. So the Jews began to practice. Look at verse 7. The Jews firmly obligated themselves and their offspring and all who joined them that without fail they would keep these 2 days according to what was written and at the time appointed every year, that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation in every clan, province, and city, and that these days of Purim should never fall into disuse among the Jews, nor should the commemoration of these days cease among their descendants. So Mordecai obligates them to do this. They then obligate themselves to observe this celebration every year in remembrance of what God had done. And they're very specific here. They say this cannot fall out of use. We can't sort of forget to do this. And they don't only just obligate themselves. It says they also obligate everyone who would join them. So it's not just the ethnic Jews who agree to do this, but everyone who sort of comes on their side says, hey, we want to be Jews now. We want to follow your God. They also are obligating them to acknowledge and observe this celebration as well. So Mordecai inaugurates the celebration. The Jews then practice the celebration. And then lastly, number 3, look at verse 29. Queen Esther authorizes the celebration. Verse 29, then Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail and Mordecai the Jew, gave full written authority, confirming this second letter about Purim. Letters were sent to all the Jews to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus in words of peace and truth, that these days of Purim should be observed and that their appointed seasons, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther obligated them, and as they had obligated themselves and their offspring with regard to their fast and their lamenting, the command of Esther confirmed these practices of Purim, and it was recorded in writing. So here you have this royal decree, and think about this. Here is the very empire of Persia, at the direction of Mordecai and Queen Esther, basically commanding that the Jews celebrate and remember God's deliverance of them year after year after year, which is phenomenal to think about that. When you think about how the story began, you think about how dark and gloomy and and discouraging it was and how bad things looked. Now at the very end of the story, the very empire that was set up to destroy them is now commanding that they make sure every year they celebrate and remember how God worked this miraculous deliverance on their behalf. So, I want to walk through a few ways to apply this to our own life and our own heart as God's people. First of all, I want to ask the question, why is it that God commanded Israel, and I think this is God's command through Mordecai, why is it that God commands Israel to remember and celebrate his deliverance of them? Why does God do this? And I think there are 4 reasons. Number 1, because they would be prone to forget it. You say, well, how in the world could they forget something like that? Well, look around the world. The majority of those who would probably call themselves Jews don't observe this. And so you can see how it would be easy to forget. Even in that moment, you would think, well, how in the world could they ever forget something so amazing and so miraculous that God did on their behalf? So number 1 reason is that they'd be prone to forget it. But secondly, he wants them to remember because there will be more attacks that would come. Like this wouldn't be the last time that the enemy tried to destroy them. This wouldn't be the last time that God's people had a target on their back for destruction. And so God intends for them to remember what he did for them in the past so that when the times of future targeting come, they know and remember what he's done for them in years gone by. So they could endure and have hope that he would do that once again.
Think about that in the tribulation.
Okay.
I mean, think about the hope that, to your point, if they're still celebrating today, and they're still celebrating in the worst of worst times in the tribulation, think about what you would have to do to celebrate that. Not only remembering what you've said, but you'd have to give food away. You'd have to give gifts to the poor when you legitimately had.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
So it'd be a huge test of faith to do it. But in the middle of the tribulation, if they're celebrating that, remembering that, what are you celebrating? That God overcame our enemy. There you go. Right in the midst of the tribulation.
Yeah. Yep. And that actually sort of bleeds right into the 3rd reason, which is...
There you go. You're welcome.
It's a great segue, Phil. I appreciate you doing that. So first reason is why? They're prone to what? Forget. Second reason is because future attacks are coming. The 3rd reason is as an act of witness when those attacks come. So to Phil's point, if you think about, go back in the past and for the generations that would follow that generation of Esther and their, how that celebration began. And if they're doing all of these things to observe this, so they're giving gifts to each other, they're providing for the poor, they're, I don't know if they're doing this at that time, but they're, dressing up in mask and masquerade, and they're having these parades, and they have this feast where they're just times of gladness and delight. And if you're an enemy thinking about plotting and attacking God's people, that ongoing festival year after year, I think was intended to be a witness to those who would attack God's people that says, eventually they will be delighting and you will be destroyed. It was to constantly remind not just Israel that, yeah, it may be bleak now and you may have some dark days, but eventually it ends up with you delighting and your enemies being destroyed. But it's also a witness against those who would try to destroy God's people that, yes, you may initially succeed and you may have some battles that you win, but when the war is over, they will be delighting and you will be destroyed. God will ensure, just like he did with that generation, that his people will delight and that their enemies will be destroyed. So I think those are the first three reasons: prone to forget, future attacks come, and as a witness against those who would want to attack them in the future. And then the fourth reason is simply because it's worth it. Like think about everything God did. All the ways that he worked. Through everything that was happening, his hidden hand all throughout the book of Esther, and how he works through Haman's plotting and Haman's scheming, how he raises up Esther and he uses Mordecai and he uses the king, and all these things are happening, and it's just, you couldn't come up with this on your own. And you never could imagine this kind of story playing itself out the way that it did. Only God could do something so miraculous, so unexpected, so marvelous, so providential. And so he commands them to remember it and to celebrate it because it's worth it. It's that valuable that you shouldn't lose sight of what he's done and the great power and wisdom and might that it took for God to do that. And so it's worth us remembering, it's worth them remembering that work on their behalf as God's people. So keep those four reasons in mind. And then remember what the book of Esther is supposed to speak to us as God's people today. Everything God does in the past, in the Old Testament, was always what? Looking towards Christ, forward. So you think about the Exodus, you think about the sacrifices, you think about the conquest of Jericho and the conquest of the Promised Land, and all these things. They have in some way, some fashion, they're all foreshadowing some aspect of this greater deliverance that God's going to work on behalf of his people through the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Everything in the Old Testament is pointing towards that. And so that means that everything that's happening in the book of Esther, in some way, some form, some fashion, is foreshadowing an even greater deliverance for the people of God in the future. Found in Christ, worked in Christ. And so the foreshadowing is that as amazing as the reversal was in the life of Israel, from going from a day of destruction to a day of delight, from using the schemes of the enemy, using his very schemes, his very strategies to be what would destroy him and rescue God's people, that's a foreshadowing of what Christ did for us. So, in a time when it was dark and dreary for humanity, like there was no hope, God had been silent for hundreds of years, and then at the right time, Paul says in Galatians, at the right time, God sends forth his Son, born of a virgin, who then lives for us a perfect life. Satan schemes and plans and plots and uses Judas and uses the religious leadership and uses the Roman government and all those things to crucify and hopefully to destroy the Son of God, the promised Messiah. And God uses the very instrument of the death of his Son to be the instrument that would bring victory to his people through the death of Christ on the cross. And then that great reversal happens 3 days later when Christ comes forth from the tomb. He announces victory through his resurrection. He didn't die for his sins, he died for ours. That's why he's brought back to life from the death, back from death to life. So that is the great reversal that Esther is pointing to, that God's work for us and our salvation. The question then becomes, does God command you and I today to remember and celebrate that work? He does. In a host of ways. We could come up with all sorts of ways that he commands us to remember and celebrate, but two in particular. Number one, how we remember and celebrate his deliverance, I believe, is in gathering in this place as God's people on the first day of the week to worship him. I think that's the number one way that he intends for us to remember and celebrate the deliverance that he's worked for us. Is that we gather together corporately as his people, and we lift up our voices in praise and remember and celebrate what he's done. And if that isn't the number one thing that happens when we gather, then it probably was a waste of time. Churches can become machines in all the good intentions of that, right? Because you want to have excellent ministry and you want to reach people, and you have all these things that have to be well oiled to take place and to be successful and to run the way that they do. But I believe it, and I believe Satan is upset at all that if you run that machine well every Sunday and you make sure everything goes off without a hitch, but you leave this room and you haven't worshiped and remembered and celebrated, I think Satan chalks that up as a win. Says, you know what? They just ran through all the motions and everything went off without a hitch. But a very small percentage actually, as Phil said this morning, actually adored him today. They just did what they do every Sunday. So I think that God intends our gathering every week to be that way that we remember and celebrate what Christ has done for us. And then occasionally, regularly, one element of that celebration obviously is the Lord's Supper, where God gives us this visual reminder and representation of that deliverance. He says, I want you to take this bread and I want you to eat it and remember that my body was broken for you. And then I want you to take this wine and drink it, and I want you to remember that my blood was shed for you. And I don't necessarily want that to be a somber thing. I want you to remember what it cost for that to happen. But I want it to be a celebratory thing, that you celebrate and that you worship in the midst of that remembrance of the deliverance that I've worked for you. So, weekly gathering where we worship and remember, and then the regular observance of the Lord's Supper where we worship and remember his deliverance. So then back to those 4 reasons what he commands us. Remember, he commands Israel not to, or to remember and celebrate for 4 specific reasons. And I think they're the same 4 specific reasons he commands us to celebrate the way that he's commanded us in terms of gathering and the Lord's Supper. Number 1, because we're prone to forget it. And you say, well, I don't mean to forget it. Nobody means to forget what he's done. But the reality is life gets busy. And we've seen it happen over the last 2-3 decades, where what used to be priority, even in the life of God's people, has now not become priority. Like it was unthinkable 3 decades ago to have any kind of intramural athletics taking place on a Sunday or even a Wednesday night. And 3 decades ago, even in your own personal life, you would have said, well, we don't go and do these recreational things on Sunday morning, because that's the time we gather and we worship and we remember. And now we're at a place where that gathering and that worship is no longer a priority. It's only a priority if we can fit it in with everything else. And so God, because he knows we're prone to forget, says, I want you to gather every week, the very first day of the week. Not just because that's the day that Jesus rose back from the dead, but I want it to be a priority in your life. The first day of the week, the morning of that first day, that you gather with my people and you remember and you celebrate and you worship what I've done for you. That deliverance that Christ has worked on our behalf for his glory. Number two, we're to remember and celebrate in order to persevere during future attacks. Just like with Israel, like he's not done attacking us. When you survive one attack, it's not like, glad I don't have to ever do that again. Right? That moment doesn't come until you don't have another breath in you, or whenever he comes back. So just like with Jesus in the wilderness, Satan comes to him those 3 times and offers these 3 temptations, and he succeeds and he's victorious, praise the Lord. But in Luke's account it says this, he left him and he was going to return at an opportune time. So he may leave when you've been victorious over the attack, but he is coming back when he sees an opportunity. And when he comes back, because he sees an opportunity, how you and I persevere through that attack is by remembering and celebrating the victory that Christ has won for us. We remember what he has done, and so that gives us hope to persevere through whatever present attack, whatever fresh hail he's pouring out on us in that moment. Do you know that in Nazi Germany, in the concentration camps, if a Jew was found to have this book in their possession, the book of Esther, they immediately were killed. Like immediately. Why? Exactly. They didn't want you to have any hope. So this book of Esther gave God's people hope to persevere. And so if they were found to possess it, they killed them instantly because they didn't want any hope among God's people. So God calls you and I to remember and to celebrate on a regular basis, because when future attacks come, it's God's past deliverance of us that enables us to persevere through that attack. Number 3, we're to remember and celebrate as a witness to the world. So we gather and we worship and we celebrate, not just for ourselves. There's a lot of benefits we just talked about. So we don't forget, so we can persevere through future attacks. But I believe that our visual gathering in this place is meant to be a witness to the world around us. That when unbelievers drive by on a Sunday morning, and all these neighbors that maybe don't go to church, and they see a parking lot full of cars at 8:30, 9 o'clock, whatever it is, and they see that there's a people there that make it a priority to get up on a Sunday morning and gather together with people they probably wouldn't go to a restaurant with sometimes, right? Because we have different preferences and likes and all those kinds of things, different social, economic backgrounds that bind us all together, to make it a priority to come in this room and to worship and to celebrate and to teach and to volunteer and all those other things. And what it says is it's a witness to the unbelievers that say, okay, why did they do that? Why do they make that a priority and not going to the lake or not going to ball or whatever it is? It must be important. So it's a witness to those around us when we gather and we celebrate and we worship. But the fourth reason, new heavens, new earth, I believe that we will celebrate and remember his deliverance of us through the person and work of Christ. And it's a part of what we'll do forever and ever and ever and ever. Exactly how that looks like, what it looks like, I don't know. But I think it'll be a regular practice that we do to remember and celebrate what Christ has worked for us on the cross and the empty tomb. So why, in the new heavens and the new earth, will we do that continually? It can't be because we're prone to forget it. Like we won't forget it there. We won't have any other priorities, right? It can't be because of a way to persevere against future attacks, because there won't be any future attacks. Like that's when it will be over, right? No more attacks from the enemy. He's in the lake of fire. He's done. And so it can't be for that reason. And it also can't be as a witness to the world, because that form of witnessing is now over. Like we only have these handful of decades in eternity to witness. Like we have this privilege right now that's only for this time to bear witness to an unbelieving world of Christ's deliverance and his work. So it can't be for that third reason of witness. So it's not because we're prone to forget. It's not because we need help persevering through future attacks. It's not because of witness. So why will we continually remember and celebrate in the new heavens and the new earth his deliverance? Because it's worth it. Like it's worth it. Like it's valuable. And the one who worked it for us is deserving of it. Like we sang this morning, you're worthy of it all, right? You're worthy of it all. For from you come all things, and to you are all things. You deserve the glory. So I think that part of what we'll do for eternity in the new heavens and the new earth is we'll remember and we'll celebrate and we'll worship. Simply because he and what he has done and what he has accomplished is worthy. And if it's worthy then, it's worthy now.
I think that we'll celebrate and worship because of our love for him, not so that, because we do a lot of things now in our flesh so that we feel God will see us, or so that others will. But once we reach that level of worship, that purity and love with Christ, I think we'll do it because of our love and gratefulness to worship him
Yeah.
for eternity.
I think so too. Yeah. All right, any other comments? I want to leave some time for questions in case you wanted to pepper fill with anything.
Wouldn't baptism be the same